childhood home held a secret so dark that it could shatter everything you thought you knew. I returned, walked through those familiar rooms, and what I discovered wasn't nostalgia. It was a horrifying truth waiting to be unearthed. This is a new channel with incredible stories every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. My name is Alex, and I'm 34 years old. By trade, I'm an architect, a man who spends his days dealing in blueprints, load-bearing walls, and the unyielding logic of physics. I find comfort in structure, in things that make sense. My passion, however, is restoration, taking something old, something that has been forgotten, and breathing new life into it while honoring its past. It's a delicate dance between what was and what could be. I suppose that's why I came back. My parents, both gone now within a year of each other, left me the house. The house, not just a structure of wood and nails, but the entire repository of my childhood. Oak Crest, we called it, for the two ancient oak trees that stood like sentinels in the front yard. For weeks it sat empty, a silent monument to a life that was no longer there. The lawyers' letters piled up. Real estate agents left polite but persistent voicemails. A property with great bones, they'd say. I knew it had great bones. I knew every single one of them. I knew the floorboard on the third step of the main staircase that always groaned a low C-sharp, the loose pane in the kitchen window that rattled when the wind blew from the north, the faint scent of my mother's lavender soap that still clung to the upstairs linen closet. Returning wasn't a choice, not really. It was an obligation, a final act of love and farewell. My plan was simple. Spend a week sorting through a lifetime of accumulated belongings, patch up a few things, and hand the keys over to a realtor. I thought the hardest part would be the emotional weight of it all. The ghosts of laughter in the hallways and the shadows of my parents in their favorite armchairs. I was prepared for sadness, for a bittersweet ache of nostalgia. I was not prepared for the truth. The first day was exactly as I'd expected. I unlocked the heavy oak door, and the air that hit me was a time capsule. A thick, still cocktail of dust, old paper, cedar from the closets, and the faint, phantom smell of my dad's pipe tobacco. I walked through the downstairs rooms, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The living room, where sunlight streamed through the large bay window, illuminating dancing dust motes. I could almost see myself at 5 years old, lying on the Persian rug, lining up my little green army men for a grand, imaginary battle. I ran my hand along the scarred mantelpiece, a testament to a few failed indoor boomerang experiments. Each scratch was a story. In the kitchen, I instinctively reached for the cookie jar on the counter, a worn ceramic owl, before remembering it would be empty. For 30 years, that owl had never been empty. The silence in the house was profound, a living entity. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of life, of the hum of the refrigerator, the murmur of the television, the sound of my mother humming in the kitchen. I spent the day sorting through old photo albums, my heart aching with a familiar, gentle grief. There I was, a gap-toothed kid on a tricycle. There were my parents on their wedding day, impossibly young and radiant. Holidays, birthdays, school plays, a perfectly curated timeline of a happy, unremarkable childhood. An only child, doted on, loved. My parents were good people. My father, a quiet, methodical history professor. My mother, a vibrant artist who filled our home with color and warmth. They weren't people with secrets. They were an open book, or so I thought. The first hint that something was wrong came on the second day. I was in my old bedroom, a place that should have been the most familiar, the most comforting space in the entire world. It was smaller than I remembered, as childhood rooms always are. The faded, glow-in-the-dark stars were still stuck to the ceiling, a faint constellation of my youth. The walls, once covered in posters of sports cars and rock bands, were bare and painted a neutral, forgettable beige, a change made when I left for college. I was checking the integrity of the walls, running my hand along the plaster, a force of professional habit. That's when I felt it. A draft. A tiny yet persistent stream of cold air trickling from a spot on the north-facing wall, right beside where my bed used to be. It was strange. This was an interior wall, shared with the master bedroom. There should be no draft. I pressed my ear against it, expecting to hear the wind whistling through a crack in the exterior siding on the other side of my parents' room. But there was nothing. just the deep, muffled silence of the house. As an architect, I couldn't ignore it. It was a puzzle, a loose end. I dismissed it at first. Old houses settle. Things shift. A small crack in the plaster, maybe. I'd patch it up before the sale. But it nagged at me. My dad was meticulous about home maintenance. He was the kind of man who would spend a whole Saturday hunting down the source of a single squeak in the floor. He would never have left a draft like this. It just didn't fit with the man I knew. Later that evening, fueled by a thermos of coffee and a growing, unnameable curiosity, I went back to the wall. I tapped it gently with my knuckles. Solid, 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 and then a subtle change in resonance. A hollow sound. My heart gave a little thump. It wasn't a loud, obvious hollowness, but it was there, a dull, flat thud instead of a sharp, crisp rap. My mind raced through architectural possibilities. A forgotten heating duct? A plumbing chase? But the blueprints for this house, which I had studied years ago for a college project, showed nothing. It was supposed to be a standard lath and plaster wall, filled with insulation. Nothing more. The feeling of unease began to curdle into something sharper. I went down to the garage and found my dad's old tool chest. Wiping away a layer of dust, I pulled out a tape measure and a stud finder. Back upstairs, the little electronic device beeped predictably over the vertical studs, but in the area of the draft, it went silent. A 3-foot wide section between two studs showed nothing. It was just empty space. My rational architect's brain was at war with a primal sense of dread. I measured the dimensions of my room, then went into my parents' room and measured it. I did the math. My breath caught in my throat. There were almost 4 feet of space unaccounted for between the two rooms. A sliver of the house that, according to my measurements, did not exist. It was almost midnight now. The house was darker, the shadows deeper. The familiar creaks and groans seemed less like the settling of an old structure and more like whispers. I stood in front of the wall, my hand resting on the cold spot. Every instinct I had was screaming. Part of me, the logical part, wanted to go to bed, to call a contractor in the morning, to let someone else solve this structural anomaly. But another part, a deeper, more insistent voice, needed to know. It felt like the wall was holding its breath, waiting. What would you have done? Would you have just patched the wall and moved on, content to ignore the inexplicable? Or would you have torn it down like I did? Let me know in the comments. I couldn't leave it. I took a deep breath, went back to the garage, and grabbed a crowbar and a heavy hammer. Standing in the middle of my childhood bedroom, tools in hand, I felt like a trespasser, a vandal. This was sacrilege, but the need to understand was stronger than my sense of preservation. I took the hammer and swung. The first impact was deafening in the silent house, a brutal crack that sent a spider web of fractures through the plaster. I flinched, half expecting my father's ghost to appear and scold me for damaging the property. But there was only silence. I swung again, and then again, plaster and lath breaking away, revealing the dark cavity behind. The draft became a steady flow of cold, musty air that smelled of time itself, stale and stagnant, like a sealed tomb. Once I had a hole big enough, I shone my phone's flashlight inside. My beam cut through the darkness, illuminating not insulation or wooden beams, but wallpaper. Faded wallpaper with a pattern of small, dancing yellow ducklings. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a crawlspace or a forgotten bit of construction. This was a room. A hidden room. My hands shaking, I worked feverishly, tearing away the rest of the wall with the crowbar until I had an opening large enough to step through. I hesitated at the threshold, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This felt wrong, like I was crossing a boundary I was never meant to cross. Taking another shaky breath, I stepped through the jagged hole in the wall and into the past. The room was small, no bigger than a large walk-in closet. The air was thick and heavy, and dust motes swirled in my flashlight beam like a miniature galaxy. It was a child's room, perfectly preserved. A silent, heartbreaking diorama. A small, white-painted wooden bed with a faded patchwork quilt was tucked into one corner. Next to it, a little bedside table held a dusty glass of water, long since evaporated, and a small, delicate music box with a ballerina on top. A tiny wooden desk and chair sat against the opposite wall, and on the desk, an open book lay face down, as if the reader had just stepped away for a moment. The walls were adorned with childish drawings, crayon sketches of a smiling sun, a lopsided house, and a family of stick figures holding hands. A small blonde-haired girl stood between a man and a woman. But there was another, smaller figure beside them, a crudely drawn baby in a bundle. I felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped out from under me. None of this was mine. My childhood room had been on the other side of that wall. I was an only child. So who did this room belong to? I walked slowly, carefully, afraid to disturb the silent scene. My light fell on the little bookshelf. The books were classics: Goodnight Moon, The Velveteen Rabbit, Where the Wild Things Are. My parents had read all of these to me, but these weren't my copies. These were older, the covers more worn. My gaze was drawn back to the desk. Beside the open book was a diary. It was a simple, cloth-bound journal with a small, tarnished brass lock. The lock had been broken. With trembling fingers, I picked it up. On the first page, in the careful, looping cursive of a young girl, was a name, Lily's diary. Lily. I didn't know a Lily. My family tree was a short, simple affair. I knew all my cousins, my aunts, my uncles. There had never been a Lily. I sat down on the edge of the tiny, creaking chair, the dust puffing up around me, and I began to read. The first entries were cheerful, filled with the simple joys of a child's life. Today, Mama read me the story about the rabbit again. It's my favorite because the rabbit becomes real. Daddy built a new birdhouse for the garden. I watched him from my window. I wish I could go outside and help. That phrase, "from my window," started to appear more and more. A strange melancholy began to creep into the entries. Dr. Miller came again today. He had a cold mask on his face. He said, "I have to be extra careful. Mama says I am her special fragile flower." I saw the neighbor kids playing outside in the snow. They were building a snowman. I drew a picture of it. It's not the same as touching the snow. A chilling realization began to dawn on me. This child, Lily, was confined to this room. I kept reading, my hands gripping the small book so tightly my knuckles were white. Her world was these four walls: her window, her books, and her parents. My parents. She wrote about my mother's songs, my father's stories. It was them, there was no doubt. But her voice in the diary grew weaker, the entries shorter. The cough is back. It hurts to breathe deep. Mama cried today when she was tucking me in. She told me not to worry, that I would be strong enough to play outside soon. I'm so tired all the time. The sun looks so warm on the floor. The final entry was just a few words, the handwriting shaky and faint. Mama said she has a secret, a surprise for me. She said a baby brother is coming soon. She said he will be my best friend and we can play together when I'm better. I will name him Alex. The diary fell from my hands. It hit the dusty floor with a soft thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Alex. She was talking about me. I wasn't an only child. I had a sister, an older sister named Lily, who had lived and suffered and died within these walls, just a few feet from where I slept my entire childhood. The grief hit me like a physical blow, a raw, ragged thing for a person I had never met but who was a part of me. But beneath the grief was a tidal wave of confusion and a cold, creeping anger. Why? Why had they never told me? Why had they sealed this room, erasing her existence so completely that it was as if she had never been? It was a betrayal so profound, it fundamentally altered the foundation of my entire life. My happy childhood, my doting parents, it was all cast in a new, sinister light. Was my existence just a replacement? A second chance? A way to forget the child they had lost? I stumbled out of the hidden room, back into my own, gasping for air as if I'd been underwater. My bedroom no longer felt like mine. The whole house felt alien, a mausoleum hiding a secret I was never meant to find. The nostalgic warmth was gone, replaced by a deep, chilling cold that had nothing to do with the draft from the wall. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, sitting on my childhood bed, staring at the jagged hole in the wall, the dark maw that led to a truth I couldn't comprehend. The next morning, I began to search the rest of the house, not for keepsakes but for evidence. I was an investigator in the ruins of my own family. In the back of my mother's closet, tucked away in a locked hat box I'd always assumed held old jewelry, I found them. A small bundle of letters, a lock of blonde hair tied with a blue ribbon, and a single faded photograph. It was a picture of my mother, younger and impossibly sad, holding a tiny, pale baby. On the back, in my father's neat handwriting, it said, "Our Lily, March 1987 to October 1991. She died just 4 months before I was born." There was also a death certificate. The cause was listed as severe combined immunodeficiency, or SCID, the bubble boy disease. It meant she had virtually no immune system. A common cold could have killed her. The sealed room suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. It wasn't a prison, it was a sanctuary. A sterile, desperate attempt to keep her alive in a world that was toxic to her. The letters were from my mother to her sister, my Aunt Carol. They were a raw, unfiltered chronicle of hope, turning to despair. She wrote of the constant fear, the sterilization routines, the crushing isolation for both her and her daughter. And then, the final letters, written after Lily's death. "I can't bear to look at her room," she wrote. "John and I, we can't live with it. We've decided to seal it. Maybe it's wrong, but the pain is too much. The new baby is coming, and he deserves a life free from this shadow. He deserves parents who can smile without it being a lie. We will never speak of her again. It is the only way we can survive." And just like that, the anger I felt began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it brought me to my knees. It wasn't a malicious act. It wasn't that they didn't love her. They loved her so much that her absence created a black hole in their lives, and they did the only thing they could think of to keep from being consumed by it. They built a wall, a literal physical wall of plaster and lath, and an emotional wall around their hearts. They gave me a life of uncomplicated happiness, but they paid for it with a secret grief they carried every single day. All those little moments from my childhood suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. My mother's fierce overprotectiveness whenever I got a simple cough. My father's quiet, melancholic moods that would descend without warning. The way they would sometimes look at me with an intensity, a mixture of love and a sorrow I never understood. They weren't just looking at me. They were seeing a ghost, too. They were seeing the child they had lost, and the child they were so terrified of losing. Do you think they did the right thing? To try and protect me from that pain, even if it meant living a lie? It's a question I've been wrestling with every single minute since I found that room. The house is no longer just a house. It's a story. It's a memorial. I spent the next few days not cleaning it out but carefully, reverently, exploring Lily's room. I wound the music box. A tinny, haunting version of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" filled the silent room. I looked through her drawings, seeing my own family through her eyes. I held the small, worn copy of the Velveteen Rabbit and imagined my mother's voice reading the words. I found a small handprint, immortalized in dried paint on a piece of paper. It was so small, "I can't sell this house. Not now." Selling it would feel like sealing that room all over again, like burying her a second time. It feels like my responsibility now, my duty as the brother she never got to meet, to honor her memory, to let her story be known. I called my Aunt Carol. When I told her what I'd found, she was silent for a long time, and then she just sobbed. She told me she had honored their wishes, had never spoken of Lily, but that it had been a heavy burden on her for over 30 years. She was relieved. She was coming to visit next week. We are going to talk about my sister. This discovery hasn't just given me a past I never knew I had. It has given me a future I never expected. My work, my life as an architect, suddenly feels different. I always focused on structures, on the physical form of a building. But now I understand that a home isn't just about the walls that hold it up. It's about the stories those walls hold inside, the joy, the love, and sometimes the horrifying, heartbreaking secrets. My own story isn't over, not by a long shot. I have a feeling this is just the beginning of understanding who my parents were and who I am. If you want to see where this discovery takes me next, and how I plan to honor my sister's memory within these walls, make sure you're subscribed. For now, I'm sitting here in the living room of Oak Crest, the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. The hole in my bedroom wall is still there. It's not a wound anymore. It's an opening. A doorway. For the first time since my parents died, the house doesn't feel empty. It's quiet, yes. But it's not empty. I feel a presence here now. Not a ghost to be afraid of, but a gentle, lingering memory. The memory of a little girl who loved yellow ducks, who wished she could touch the snow, and who was excited to meet her baby brother. Share your thoughts or theories in the comments. I read all of them.